Imagine this. The year is 1342, and 8 wooden ships groan beneath the weight of cargo and men as they fight the icy swells of the North Sea. Suddenly, the water beneath them splits open as if the ocean itself were tearing apart. A massive shape surges upward, so vast that sailors at first mistake it for a new island rising from the deep. Then it moves. A serpent, longer than any cathedral is tall, with scales that gleam like wet iron, coils around the first vessel. Screams echo into the storm as the ship cracks in half. Men hurled into the freezing black, their cries cut short by the crushing embrace of the beast. Within minutes, hundreds are dragged under, their blood staining the surf red. Of the 8 ships that left port, only one would ever return. The rest, and the 300 men aboard, were swallowed by the sea and by something far worse that lived within it. Before we dive into this forgotten tragedy of the medieval seas, if you enjoy uncovering the dark corners of history, those places where myth and terror collide with reality, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories just like this, and leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from. I'm always fascinated by how these tales of the past reach us across oceans and centuries, connecting us in shared curiosity and awe. To understand the full horror of what unfolded that day, we need to step back into the world of 14th century Northern Europe. The North Sea was not just a body of water, it was an artery of survival, feeding trade across the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and the Hanseatic League. Ships ferried salted fish, timber, furs, and grain to distant ports, binding together cities and empires through commerce. For merchants and sailors alike, the sea was wealth, but also a daily gamble with death. Storms could rise from clear skies within hours, ripping sails and splintering hulls. Icebergs drifted south from frozen waters, invisible in the fog, until impact shattered a crew's last hope. And beneath it all, hidden in fathoms no man had ever measured, lurked the monsters. Medieval chronicles are littered with their names: the Hafgufa, the Kraken, the Havermer, the sea serpent. To coastal villagers, these were not myths, but warnings. Shadows in the waves that stretched too long, wakes that moved against the current, entire shoals of fish disappearing as though swallowed by something immense. Every sailor knew the stories, and most laughed them off until night fell and the creaking timbers whispered otherwise. Because in that age, when a man left the harbor, he was as close to the unknown as a soul could be. And in 1342, the unknown rose to the surface, and it came with teeth. The fleet that set sail that spring was not unusual for its time, though its fate would become one of the most whispered about tragedies of the century. 8 ships, their hulls heavy with cargo, creaked out of the harbor bound for the trading cities of the Hanseatic League. On board were more than 300 men, fishermen hardened by years at sea, merchants eager for profit, and guards hired to protect both cargo and crew from pirates. Their holds brimmed with salted herring and dried cod, staples of medieval Europe that fed armies and monasteries alike. Barrels of timber and bundles of furs cut from the frozen north promised wealth in the bustling markets of Lübeck and Hamburg. Grain from inland farms filled the gaps, packed tight to sustain distant cities. These were not men chasing glory or adventure. They were workers, laborers, men seeking survival and fortune through the dangerous waters of the North Sea. The voyage was one of routine, a well-mapped path that countless others had taken. But the sea, in its silence, was already preparing something different. On the second day, the first signs arrived. Quiet, subtle, almost easy to dismiss. The wind that had carried their sails so briskly out of port died, leaving the ships adrift on an unnatural calm. The surface of the water smoothed into glass, not a ripple, not a wave, as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. The sailors muttered prayers, for calm seas often meant storms were gathering beyond sight. But it was not just the stillness of the water. The birds vanished. Usually gulls trailed fleets like scavengers, their shrieks filling the air, eager for scraps tossed from decks. Now, the sky was empty. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of wood and the uneasy shifting of men's boots. Then came the smell. At first, only a few noticed it, a faint tang of sulfur on the breeze, sharp and acrid, as though the earth itself had been scorched. Soon, it grew stronger, clinging to the sails, thick enough to burn in the throat. One sailor swore he smelled blood, metallic and raw, like an open wound carried on the wind. Others whispered of drowned villages, cursed waters, and sea graves stirring below. The captains tried to keep order, barking commands, telling the men to stay steady and prepare for weather. But superstition has always traveled faster than reason, and in those days, every strange omen was a sign of something worse to come. Men crossed themselves, clutched rosaries, muttered the names of saints. The sea was too calm, the silence too deep, and in that silence, far beneath the keels of those 8 ships, something stirred. It began as a shadow. At first, a few men at the stern noticed it, something vast, moving beneath the mirrored surface of the sea. One called out that it was a sandbank, that they had drifted into shallow waters. Another shouted back that no sandbank could shift against the current. Within minutes, every sailor on every deck was staring over the rails, pointing, whispering, their faces pale in the strange, sulphurous light. The shadow stretched on and on, longer than the length of their largest ship, darker than the ocean around it. It slid beneath the water with slow, deliberate purpose, circling the fleet as if taking measure of its prey. The guards gripped their spears tighter, eyes darting from bow to horizon, searching for sails of enemy ships, for pirates hidden in the mist. But there were no pirates. There was nothing but the silence, the stink of blood on the air, and that impossible shape gliding beneath them. A murmur spread among the crews. Some insisted it was just the swell of a storm, the bedrock shifting below. Others swore it was a great whale, the kind that could swallow a boat whole, but rarely troubled men. Yet many more fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads against the damp planks, muttering prayers through trembling lips. The older sailors knew the stories, the ones told by firelight in every fishing village along the coast. The Havermere, the sea serpent of the north, a creature so immense it could coil around an entire ship and crush it like kindling. The debate ended in a single instant. Without warning, the water heaved upward in a roar of foam and spray as a column of scaled flesh broke the surface. It rose higher and higher, thicker than any mast, gleaming wet and black-green in the dim light. The men froze, eyes wide, their minds scrambling to understand what they saw. Then the serpent struck. It slammed down against the nearest vessel with the force of a thunderclap. The ship didn't splinter piece by piece. It broke in two, snapped like a twig. The crack of timber split the air, followed by the screams of men tumbling into the boiling sea. Barrels of fish and furs spilled into the foam, swept aside as if they were leaves. The serpent's body writhed around the wreck, coils tightening, dragging men under in seconds. Those who surfaced thrashed desperately, only to be dragged down again by the crushing weight of the beast's tail. From the other ships, the sailors could only watch in frozen terror as one of their own was erased before their eyes. The cries of drowning men mingled with the groan of breaking wood, and in the middle of it all, the vast serpent moved with terrifying grace, too fast, too powerful, too real for any prayer to stop. Panic ripped through the fleet like fire through dry straw. Orders barked by captains were swallowed in the chaos as men screamed, shoved, and clawed for space at the rails. Some tried to ready the sails, but their hands shook so badly the ropes slipped through their fingers. Others dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, praying aloud, their voices rising in a desperate chorus drowned out by the roar of the sea. The fleet was no longer a disciplined convoy. It was a collection of terrified souls, each man certain that death had already chosen him. Then, the serpent rose again. Its head broke the surface in a cascade of white foam, larger than the prows of the ships it hunted. Its mouth gaped wide, lined with jagged teeth, each as long as a man's forearm, dripping seawater and slime. The sound it made was not a roar, but a grinding, guttural rasp, like boulders grinding together in the deep. Its body shimmered with scales darker than iron, each plate reflecting the dim light like burnished metal. When it turned, the men saw its eyes, two burning orbs, green and gold, glowing with a cold, alien hunger. The serpent lunged. In one sweep, its massive jaws clamped onto the hull of the second ship. The timbers shrieked, bending under impossible pressure before exploding into splinters. Dozens of men were pitched into the churning sea. The creature thrashed once, and the wreckage vanished beneath the waves, sucked down as though the ocean itself had swallowed it whole. Survivors flailed in the red-tinted foam, their cries strangled as the coils of the beast wrapped around them, pulling them under with horrifying ease. The third ship tried to turn away, sails straining in the sudden gust that seemed almost mocking in its timing. But the serpent was faster. Its tail, thick as an ancient oak, slammed against the vessel's side with bone-shaking force. The hull cracked, water poured in, and within moments, the ship listed fatally. Men scrambled up the rigging, clinging to the masts, as if height could save them, only to be swept into the sea as the mast toppled into the surf. Their voices vanished one by one, drowned out by the shriek of rending wood and the hiss of the serpent's scales as it coiled tighter around the debris. 3 ships gone, hundreds of men already lost, and still the monster moved among them, its vast shape circling, its eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark, searching for the next ship to drag into the abyss. Through the chaos, one ship tried to fight back. It was the largest of the convoy, a vessel armed not just for trade, but for defense against pirates. Its crew, drilled in combat, scrambled to their positions even as fear threatened to unman them. Harpoons were hauled from racks, ropes hastily tied, and a crude catapult creaked as men dragged it into place on the deck. Captains on the smaller ships screamed for order, but it was the soldiers and sailors aboard this warship who became the fleet's last hope. The first volley of harpoons arced through the air, glinting in the dim light before striking the serpent's body. Iron tips pierced the thick, glistening scales with sickening resistance. The beast convulsed, thrashing its immense coils across the water, sending geysers skyward. Men cheered for a heartbeat, believing they had wounded it. But then the serpent's scream cut through the air, a sound so inhuman, so piercing, it seemed to split bone. It was not just a roar, it was a grinding howl, a shriek of rage and pain, as though the sea itself had found a voice. The catapult fired next, launching a flaming barrel of pitch that shattered against the creature's back. Fire licked briefly across its slick hide before the waves swallowed it whole. The serpent reared in fury, its body rising higher than the tallest mast, casting a shadow that blotted out the sky. The men who had dared to hope now stared in dread as the beast turned its massive head toward the warship. Its jaws parted, a hiss spilling from its throat, a sound like steam escaping from the earth, long and venomous, that set teeth rattling in skulls. With a speed no one thought possible, it struck. Its body slammed against the warship's hull with the force of an earthquake. Wood groaned, splintered, and snapped. Men were flung from their posts as the deck pitched violently beneath them. Another wave of harpoons flew, but most clattered harmlessly against the serpent's iron-like scales. Those that stuck only drove it into deeper fury. The sounds of battle became unbearable, the thunderous crack of breaking beams, the screeches of twisted ropes snapping apart, the bone-snapping crunch as the serpent's coils crushed men beneath them like dolls. The ocean itself seemed to wail, echoing the terror of the dying, and through it all, that monstrous hiss and grinding roar, vibrating through the timbers and into the very marrow of every man still alive. The sea had turned into a battlefield, but it was no battle of equals. It was a slaughter. The serpent rose in its full, impossible height, coils writhing like mountains of living muscle. Then, with a single terrible motion, it threw its body against the sea. The impact was like a hammer striking the ocean floor. A wall of water surged upward, towering higher than the masts, blotting out the horizon. For a frozen instant, the sailors saw it, a wave born not of storm or wind, but of a beast's wrath. The wave came crashing down. It struck the fleet with annihilating force, swallowing ships whole. Decks vanished beneath tons of water. Sails ripped free and disappeared into the roaring black. 2 ships were lifted high, their keels exposed like dying fish before they capsized and shattered on the surface. Men clung desperately to rigging, only to be torn away by the torrent, their screams silenced as the sea consumed them. The serpent moved through the chaos with effortless grace, its massive form cutting through the surge like a blade. It lashed out at wreckage, snapping beams like twigs, wrapping its coils around what remained of the warship and dragging it under with groaning timbers and the agonized cries of men trapped below deck. Blood spread across the surface in dark clouds, mixing with broken barrels, shattered planks, and the drifting bodies of the dead. The sounds of the dying carried over the waves. Cries for help, desperate pleas to saints and to God. Broken voices shouting the names of wives, of children, of homes they would never see again. A handful tried to cling to floating debris, but each time the serpent passed, the water boiled, pulling them down into the black depths. By the time the sea calmed again, nearly all the ships were gone. What had begun as a fleet of 8 proud vessels was reduced to splinters scattered across a bloodied tide. The air was thick with salt, smoke, and the stench of death. And above it all, that vast shadow still circled, unhurried, its glowing eyes watching as though the slaughter had only been sport. For the survivors, there was no longer hope of victory, no thought of resistance. There was only the unbearable knowledge that the sea itself had turned against them, and that the prayers echoing across the water would be the last words most of them would ever speak. Amid the wreckage and screams, one ship managed to survive. Its sails were torn to ribbons, its rudder shattered, and half its crew lost to the waves. Yet by some grim fortune, it remained afloat. The men aboard no longer steered. The sea itself carried them, drifting like a coffin across the endless gray. They dared not shout, dared not weep, for fear the serpent still lingered beneath the waves, listening. Only when the water stilled and the creature's shadow melted back into the abyss did the survivors begin to breathe again. Of the 300 men who had left port, fewer than 50 staggered onto the shore days later. Hollow-eyed and frostbitten, they spoke not as warriors returning from battle, but as haunted souls who had glimpsed something beyond human reckoning. They told of a creature longer than the horizon, its body armored in scales that no blade could pierce. Its mouth, they said, could swallow a ship whole, and its eyes glowed like molten metal in the dark. Some claimed it had horns, others swore it bore spines down its back like jagged cliffs. All agreed on one thing: it was no beast of this world. The accounts spread quickly. Chroniclers recorded the words with a mixture of horror and skepticism, yet the survivors swore their oaths on relics and saints' bones. They had not faced storm or pirate, but a serpent of the deep, the Havermer of northern legend. Priests whispered it was a punishment for sin, a divine scourge, sent to humble men who dared profit too greatly from the sea. But among fishermen and sailors, the whispers grew darker still. They compared it to the old sagas, the tales told long before Christ's name reached the fjords. They spoke of Jörmungandr, the world serpent of Norse myth, the child of Loki, cast into the sea by the gods, destined to grow until it encircled the world. When it rose, the Skalds had warned, it would herald the twilight of men, the breaking of order, the end of days. Some said that in 1342, the prophecy had stirred, that the serpent of the North Sea was not merely a beast, but the shadow of Ragnarok itself rising to the surface. And so the tale lived on, etched into chronicles, whispered in taverns, prayed against in churches. The sea had taken its price in blood, and those who survived bore not victory, but memory. A memory so terrifying, it would outlast them, becoming legend. The loss was staggering. More than 300 men were gone, swallowed by the sea in a single night. Families waited on the docks for ships that would never return, widows clutching children, as harbor masters read their lists with shaking hands. For the towns that had sent the fleet, it was not only grief but ruin. The loss of cargo, ships, and skilled sailors was a wound that bled for years. Markets faltered, debts mounted, and whispers grew in every tavern that the sea itself had turned against mankind. The authorities searched for explanations. Some claimed it had been a storm too sudden and violent to resist. Others argued pirates had struck, though no wreckage of enemy ships was ever found, and no ransom demands were made. Yet the testimonies of the survivors could not be ignored. Their words were transcribed by monks and chroniclers, committed to parchment with the same ink used for royal decrees and saints' lives. And in the margins of these manuscripts, scribes sketched crude outlines of a serpent coiling around ships, its mouth gaping wide enough to swallow men whole. In cloisters and courts, the debate raged. Scholars of the time argued whether such a creature could exist. Some suggested it was a monstrous whale, distorted by fear. Others whispered it was the Kraken, or a demon conjured from the depths to punish the arrogance of man. Yet the descriptions of the survivors, consistent, unshaken, repeated even under oath, planted seeds of dread that no reason could uproot. Through the years that followed, the serpent of 1342 became both warning and omen. Mariners carved its likeness into charms for protection, while priests denounced it as a sign of divine wrath. Chroniclers linked it to the ancient Norse prophecies, claiming that Jörmungandr, the world serpent, had briefly risen to remind mankind of its fragility. By candlelight in northern halls, men whispered that Ragnarok was nearer than anyone dared admit. And so, the tale straddled the line between history and myth. Was it a beast of flesh and scale? Some colossal creature of the deep yet undiscovered? Was it only fear, magnified by storm and darkness, woven into legend by desperate survivors? Or was it something more? A glimpse into the truth behind the oldest seafaring terrors, where gods and monsters still roamed unseen beneath the waves. What cannot be denied is this: in 1342, the North Sea claimed 300 souls in a way no storm or sword ever had. And whether serpent, demon, or prophecy, the shadow that rose from those depths left a scar on the memory of mankind, one that still lingers in the salt air of the northern coasts, whispering to every sailor who dares cross those waters.